Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are on part 2 of our Unlocking Our Finances conference. And the focus of this session is going to be our financial testimony. So just a fair warning, because it's a testimony, it's going to be a little bit longer than the 15 to 20 minutes I'm going to try to keep the other videos, because the stories give hope. I've been told at times that, oh, you shouldn't tell people stuff like that. That's bragging. I'm like, no, it's not bragging. It is declaring the glory of God that He has manifested in our lives. And when we declare what God has done for us and how He has redeemed us from the devourer, that brings Him glory. And also, if I had never heard the testimonies of other people for spiritually or healing or deliverance or whatnot, I would have never had hope to chase after it for myself. So I'm going to be giving you guys details about our personal finances to give you hope, and yeah, it's all about hope. Okay, so who are we? I think I forgot at the beginning to tell you who I am. My name is Julia Kelly, and I am wife of Stephen Kelly. We've been married for 16 years. We have 4 beautiful children. Michaela at this point in time is 11. Jeremiah is 8. Sophia is 5, and Serenity is 3. And so both Stephen and I grew up in pastors' homes. He comes from a generation that, as far as we're able to trace back, there's 3 generations of church leaders. With my family, there's a generation of 7 church leaders and pastors and revivalists and evangelists and whatnot, and missionaries traveling overseas. And so that being said, we both came from families that were financially poor. Poverty and charity mentality is very much ingrained in church life, which is not biblical, but that's what churchianity teaches, that pastors are supposed to be poor and you're supposed to grovel through and just be thankful that you might be able to get 3 meals on your plate a day. My parents were missionaries. They went to the overseas mission field when I was 4 years old. And we lived on average about $17,000 a year for 4 people. And my parents did learn how to tap into supernatural finances. And I never thought I was poor growing up. Stephen's parents, his mother was the senior pastor, and they ended up leaving formal ministry in order to make ends meet because it was just too tight. And also back in that generation, having a married woman being a senior pastor in a church was not acceptable. And so once she got married, she ended up being booted out of ministry. And she did do some children's revival meetings, tent meetings, stuff like that. But again, there was such a culture of this is men's work that she finally ended up getting very discouraged and leaving the ministry. So we both grew up with a poverty mentality and a spirit of poverty. And that very much impacted how our lives, how we thought about finances, how we at the time did not want to get into ministry. We were not going to struggle just to survive like our parents. And when Stephen and I got married, we ended up marrying into each other's debt, and it ended up being $1,600 a month of debt. That's not any of like just living bills. That's just to cover the debt, $1,600 a month. So for us, that was 3 student loans, a car lease payment, a line of credit. That's not even including the mortgage yet. And so if you tack on the mortgage on top of that, I think at the time our mortgage was about $1,100. And so you're really looking at $2,700 a month of debt that we did not need to carry, but we didn't know any better. After 5 years, we ended up getting pregnant. That's a whole miracle because I was born with birth defects. I was not supposed to be able to have children. God gave me a supernatural uterus transplant, which that would have to go into a healing video. And God blessed us with twins, or a pregnancy of twins. And with that whole miracle, the prophetess that prayed for us to even be able to conceive in the first place, after it was confirmed that I was pregnant, she said, good, now I can tell you part 2, that this pregnancy comes with a blessing and a curse. She said, God's been telling you to tithe, to bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, which I didn't like hearing that very much. And she warned us, if we obeyed, I would go full term, I would have a vaginal delivery, and that everything would be fine. If we disobeyed, the devourer was waiting to devour this pregnancy. And it was up to us, were we going to choose to walk in God's ways, or were we going to be stubborn and do what we wanted, which would expose us to the devourer. And I was stubborn, and I did not like anybody telling me what to do with my finances. As you can tell right there, it was mine, not God's. And I ended up with a lot of pregnancy complications. We ended up losing Mackenzie in utero. And so the twin pregnancy went down to a singleton pregnancy. I ended up getting very, very sick and lost my job. Well, I didn't lose it. I had to go on sick leave. And so our income went from 160,000 down to 50. Boom, no warning. And during that time of delaying in our obedience, the devourer got to our finances. The devourer took one of my daughters. And I could have died during that time. It was a very difficult, there was a lot of complications. And I finally had been spanked enough, that I had been humbled enough, that I was finally willing to obey. Now, in my husband's defense, he was ready to obey right from the very beginning. I was the stubborn one. And when I finally told my husband, said, fine, bring the whole tithe to the church. And I said, but you know what? It's going to be God's fault when we end up on the streets with a baby. Because I still believe that if we did bring the tithe check at that time to the church, that we would have a baby delivered alive. But that was as far as my faith was at the time. I did not believe that God would be able to protect and preserve us. But at that point, I had been told in my life I would never be able to have children. And now all of a sudden, I have the opportunity. I was willing to do what I needed to do in order to protect that child. And we finally obeyed. We brought the tithe check to the church of our whole tithe. And the Lord highlighted to us, we had to pay the tithe on the 160,000, which was when the instruction had been given, not on the 50,000 that we had left. Now, we were living in Edmonton at the time, so 160,000, we were just surviving paycheck to paycheck. So you can imagine going down to 50,000, and then we have all the bills of $160,000 lifestyle, and God is telling us to tithe the full 10% of 160, not on our net. which I'll get into later, of how tithing on your net is actually idolatry of the government. And that still opens you to devour. That's why a lot of people who tithe do end up still having devouring, because they're not tithing on the whole, because God wants the first. He wants the best. He doesn't want your scraps. So we finally obeyed. We ended up bringing the check. Immediately after the check was born, the pregnancy started to stabilize. I still had to stay at home and on bed rest, but it was no longer life and death. And during that time, we should have been $2,000 a month in the red. And yet God created a miracle so that our balance in our bank account never went down. And so bills were coming out and the balance was not going down. He also opened up unexpected sources of provision. There was some kind of government credit that was a very unusual case and I qualified for. And I didn't go looking for it. God dropped it in our laps after we obeyed. Also, Stephen was given favor with reducing our bills, and he would call and God would give him supernatural wisdom and strategies on how to reduce our bills, which, by the way, during the break from video 1 to video 2, I just got a little note that somebody else has just received favor this early into the conference already, that they've been able to reduce their bills already. So that is so cool that God is confirming his word. My daughter, Michaela, was born full term, vaginally. We were going for an emergency C-section and God popped her out before the surgeon got into the room. And so there was his miracle, his provision. We had to mix it with faith. There were complications along the way that we had to stand on the prophetic word saying, I will make it to full term, when they wanted to do an early C-section at 35 weeks. And I said, no, the prophet said, I will go full term. I will go vaginal, and that my baby would be fine. And so my midwife agreed. She was a believer and she agreed, and everything happened as God said it would. The next point down was after Michaela was born, God opened the doors for my husband to get a job transfer to a better job into Ontario. And that was God's blessing. And also because of our rebellion, God told us sell the house. And we said, no, we want to keep this house as a retirement fund. We disobeyed God by not selling that house. And we ended up in $500,000 of mortgage debt. Now, we had been taught all our lives that mortgage debt was good debt until you discover that you can't quite pay it. And then you discover it's not so good. The instruction to sell our house was during the 2008 housing crisis. And we were thinking if we just held on to it long enough, the markets would go back up and we would be able to recoup the losses. That's where our thinking was. But God's wisdom is always greater than man's wisdom. And by the time it was all said and done, we would have actually made more money if we had obeyed God and sold the house when he told us to sell it, how he told us to sell it. And so when God gives you instructions that don't make sense, don't follow man's logic, still obey, because he's God. He knows the best option. So after we were in tears trying to figure out how to pay 2 mortgages during a housing crisis, when people were losing their jobs, people were being downsized in hours. I was on maternity leave. And my husband ended up getting downsized down to, I think it was 80% of his paycheck. Thankfully, he was one of the lucky ones that did not lose his job at that time. But when you have that huge of a mortgage bill, and you were already living just trying to survive, a 20% cut is a huge cut. So when the opportunity for Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University program came through our church, we jumped at the opportunity. It taught us phenomenal stewardship of our finances. And I recommend that course to everybody that I know who's having financial issues. But it did not stop the devouring, because our disobedience had opened the door for devouring. And no amount of good stewardship will make up for disobedience and opening the door for devouring. So if all of that wasn't bad enough, as the longer we disobey, the longer we delayed in returning to God, the devouring got larger and larger. And we ended up with what they call a frivolous lawsuit. And so our tenant ended up suing us over something really silly. The judge saw right through it. The lawyer saw right through it. They knew it was very much a cash grab on the tenant's side. But because we had disobeyed, we had zero favor. And at the time, God had told us to obey his word in Matthew 5, verse 40, where it says, if somebody takes you to court and takes your shirt, you're supposed to give them your cloak too. And we later found out that God wanted to deal with her heart, and he would have easily made up the finances that we would have lost by paying that lawsuit out and giving her what she wanted. And again, God's ways are not man's ways. And her heart, because of our disobedience and thinking we were in the right and we were going to get justice, it actually caused her heart to get hardened even further against the Lord. And she said she was a Christian, but she was very bitter. She had a lot of problems in her marriage, in her family, and she was reacting out of her pain. And we just caused even more pain, which made her even more bitter towards God. And so our consequence of doing things our ways instead of God's ways, we ended up with a $30,000 spanking. And then we had property repairs because she destroyed the property. And then we ended up having an extreme emotional, marital, relational, employment, physical stress. It was the most horrific time at that time in our lives. And we finally were humbled enough. Again, I was the one leading the stubbornness. My husband was willing to do whatever it was to make the peace. And I'm like, no, we're going to fight. And tenacity is good. Stubbornness is bad. So I hadn't quite learned how to be tenacious for God's ways instead of stubbornness towards my ways at that time. So we finally obeyed in August 2013. And we had paid the initial lawsuit amount that was on the original lawsuit that she had sent us. Within 1 week, Psalm 37 verse 10 materialized, which is, for yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Yea, thou shalt diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. Within a week after she got her check and it got cashed, she just disappeared. Like poof, gone. She emptied the house. She changed the locks on us. And we had to get the police to break into our own house. And then we had to do a whole rigmarole to prove the house was ours, because there had been so many lies that we were trying to steal her house. And it was just one big mess that we had to walk through the journey of repentance and humbling. And getting all that done. But because she just up and disappeared, the legal battle suddenly got dropped. And we were finally able to move forward with the original disobedience of selling the house. And so we listed the house for the price that the Lord told us to. And we were finally able to get that on the market. Now, during all of this time, while we were preparing the house for sale, the Lord had given us 2 instructions. One, we were supposed to tithe on the sale of the house. And 2, we were not to work on the Sabbath. Now, at that time, we understood that Sunday was the Sabbath. And so when we were telling our realtor, you can work for us Monday to Saturday, you're not allowed to do anything on Sundays. And she's like, but all of the house viewings are on Sundays. If you don't do it on Sunday, no one is going to buy your house. And I said, if God told us not to do it on a Sunday, the person who needs to buy this house will come on another day. And so as we were standing in faith that God's way would work this time, we were starting to learn our lesson. We ended up getting a call from CRA saying we were caught with tax evasion and that we were going to owe $80,000 in back tax bill, and we were going to be threatened with jail time. Now, I don't know where that would have all come from, possibly a retaliatory phone call. Who knows what triggered all of that? But we had to go back to God and say, like, God, like, we obeyed and now we're getting this backlash. Like, it looks like your ways are not working. And he said, trust me, just obey and do not fear. So we continue to stand in faith. We obeyed. In order to pay the tithe off the house, we were not able to pay off the mortgage. So we ended up upside down when we sold the house. And God gave us a strategy of, instead of getting another mortgage, we ended up putting it on our line of credit that we could pay off as quickly as we could chew through. And when we did pay our taxes, and we were quaking in our boots, at this point, we now had 2 children. We're being told we're being sent to jail. And we have this massive bill on top that we don't have money for. So were they going to take the house that we were living in Niagara Falls? And all of these what if, oh my goodness, all of these scary things. And it's like, God, I don't know how this is going to work, but you promised it's going to work somehow. We filed our taxes. We did them with an accountant. He's like, you know what? You don't owe back taxes. If anything, you've done everything right. You've done more than what you were supposed to. You have done nothing wrong. And so we filed it. We ended up getting a letter back, and I wish I had kept it as proof of this testimony, that CRA apologized to us, said they had made an error, and instead of us owing them $80,000, they owed us $16,000 with everything of how we had done the rental taxes and all that stuff. That's $16,000 in addition to everything else that we had been chewing away. We were able to pay off the rest of that mortgage. And we ended up selling the property on November 1st, 2013. That very same day, on November 1st, which was the day where the obedience finally kicked in. It was finally, the obedience manifested. That very same day, the house sold. Our family manifested supernatural healings. My firstborn daughter had a diagnosis of sensory processing disorder with autistic-like behaviors, motor development delays, speech delays, academic delays, behavioral problems like most autistic kids have. That day, she instantly got healed. We walked into a healing conference. Again, we didn't plan the timing, God did. It just so happened that everything all landed on the same day of November 1st. But we happened to be in a Be in Health conference that day. We walked in with a special needs daughter. We walked out with a perfectly healthy, normal, whole, talking, walking, fully developmentally normal daughter. And after that, that just completely shook our theology big time, because at the time we were at a church that did not believe in supernatural healing. And I got healed of multiple medical issues. We all got healed of allergies. My son got healed of bowel issues, and my husband got healed of some cardiac issues just from all the stress. It ended up causing cardiac issues. Let's see here. I'm trying to stay on notes so I don't go off too far. So November 1st, all of that stuff happened. Now, jump forward to December 31st, we were having a New Year's Eve prayer meeting. And as we were praying together, there were 3 families that had joined together. We all had little kids, that it would not work for us to go out to a New Year's Eve prayer service. So we decided, you know what, everyone come to our house. We'll have a sleepover, put the little kids to bed. We'll stay up to midnight and we'll pray in the new year. During that time, God gave us a strategy. And if I hadn't been listening with my spirit, I would have missed it, because it was just a verse. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's part of the Lord's Prayer. But when I heard the verse in my heart, I knew it wasn't talking about sin there. It was talking about finances. And so we were to ask the Lord to forgive us of all of our debts. As we made that intentional act of forgiving our debtors. So who are our debtors? The banks, the mortgage lenders, the people that had taught us poor finances, the credit card companies, all the different financial institutions, student loan companies. So all 3 of our families that night went through confession, repentance, and forgiving. So that was New Year's Eve. We did our taxes. It would have been April. That's when the letter came back from CRA saying the $80,000 was forgiven, or rather, it never was due to begin with. We were given the $16,000 refund. We ended up being 100% debt-free, including this house, by April 2014. So we prayed in December 31st. By April, within 4 months, we were 100% debt-free of this house. And all outstanding debts, 100%. Another family, they were on welfare at the time of the prayer meeting, and they had tens of thousands of dollars of debt. Within a couple weeks after that prayer, he ended up getting a job that was better than the job he had before he got laid off, which resulted in the welfare. And he ended up becoming a supervisor in that position. At the same time, somebody gave them a strategy of, you know what, have you heard of such and such? Go to this specific accountant. He will be able to help you go through all these different loopholes. I believe they got a $17,000 check, which ended up paying off a whole bunch of their debts. And they qualified for some kind of special government benefit because of their specific family situation, that they would have qualified for all those years they were married, but no one had told them about it. And thing is, you can't apply for something that you don't know. And so God will give you supernatural wisdom, supernatural strategies that are already available, but due to a lack of knowledge, the people perish. And so when we get into obedience, the favor comes back. The third family, by June, they were 100% debt-free, including their house. So I'm sharing that to show the power of obedience, the power of confession, the power of forgiveness is huge, because the Bible clearly says, if you do not forgive others from the heart, the Heavenly Father will not forgive you. And when you do not forgive, He will hand you over to the tormentors, which is another word for demons. And you will have to repay everything that is due. And so when we walk in forgiveness, it gets rid of the tormentors. It gets rid of the spiritual collectors, if you will. So that was 2014. Now we are in 2020. We are now able. So I guess back up a little bit. So 2017, I ended up having my fourth child. And the Lord was telling us during that pregnancy, walk away from your nursing career, burn your ships. It's time to sail out of port. He gave me a couple of different analogies. Some of them seem to be a little contradictory, but I got the point. I was supposed to burn my bridge. I was not supposed to go back to nursing. And we were like, okay, well, I have some options. I could put my nursing career on hold so that when my kids are older, I could go back to it. And God's like, no, burn your ships. Get rid of your registration, your nursing license. He said, where I am taking you, it is going to be such a difficult path of preparation and of walking it out that if you still have your nursing career, you're going to go running back to what was easy. Now, I tell you that because obedience to God is not always the easy way. It's not the comfortable way. But you know what? I am so much more passionate. I am so much more enjoying life now than I ever did. And I loved being a nurse. I was good at it. I made lots of money at it. But nothing can replace that satisfaction when God's desires inside of your heart are fulfilled. And when you are walking in what God has created you to be, when you are walking in obedience to the calling on your life, to the anointing on your life, to what He has designed you to be, that is where you're going to find your joy, your peace, walking in that intimate relationship with the Lord, fulfilling everything that He has created you to be as you walk out His image in the earth. So I ended up surrendering my nursing license back in 2017. And it was in one of those years, sometime between 2014 and 2017, I can't remember the exact year, when God told us to do something and we obeyed. The very next paycheck after our obedience, and we were wondering, like, God, how are we going to survive without my nursing income? He ended up giving my husband a 14% raise. Now, at the time, his company was giving 1.5%, maybe if you're lucky, 2.5% raises. He got 14%. There was no explanation for it, no reason of how in the natural we could explain why he would get such a huge increase when the rest of his company did not. That's God's favor. When you walk in obedience to God, he opens up the floodgates of favor over you. So now we're in 2020. And just to be honest and vulnerable, we are now able and joyfully able to give away over 30% of our income. We're a family of 6 on a single income. My husband is a computer tech. So computer techs do not make as much as nurses. And yet we are still able to give away 30%. We do more on that, on 70% of a single income than we ever did on 160 grand a year. My daughter is in dance. My 3 of my children are in music. The 4th one's a little too little yet. We have the ability to do the extracurricular. We have the ability to enjoy eating what we want when we want. Not that we go crazy, but we're not, oh my goodness, beans and rice. And maybe if I fast for 2 days a week, we might be able to survive. We have more than enough. And on top of that, we're able to provide for people to come through our home. To when they are in transition, we are able to be that, it's like the upper room for Elisha, where the Shunammite woman built her an extra room on the top of her house. In our case, we built it in our basement for the different traveling ministers that come through and the different hospitality guests. And we've had people from all over the world come through our home. Some of them for just a single night, sometimes for 5.5 months during family crisis. God has blessed us so that we are able to use our blessings to in turn be able to be a blessing for others. And that is really what God's provision is all about. It's not so I can get more, so I can have 3 cars and 2 motorcycles and a boat and a cottage. No, he blesses us financially, provisionally, spiritually, marriage-wise, family, all the different kinds of wealth. He blesses us with that so that we can use our blessings to be a blessing to other people. And when you get that mindset that we are stewards of his blessings and the joy that comes from that, it is absolutely amazing. Especially because we did experience the stress and the shame and the guilt and the fear of being on the wrong side of the equation. That now we appreciate the joy and the freedom that we have. And that's why we want to share it with other people, because if God is willing to do that for us, he is willing to do it for all of you guys. If you're willing to walk in obedience, if you are willing to take those steps. And the blessings didn't come when we were 100% perfect. It came when we took one step of obedience and he opened some favor. And then we took another step of obedience and he opened another step of favor. And so God will always reward obedience. Even if they're little steps, he will reward it. And you will get to see that God's word is true. That when you sow in obedience, you will reap the blessings of obedience. So I'm going to end there for this part 2. And I'm going to come back at 1 o'clock for session 3, which we'll start getting into a little bit more of the technical stuff. And so you guys can have lunch, and I bless you guys to be a blessing. So for those of you who are hearing this, continue funneling those testimonies, because that was so cool getting to hear about one person already receiving favor on reducing their bills. And I expect that we're going to be hearing more of those testimonies as we go through. So God bless you all. And we will see you back here at 1 o'clock. So you've got about an hour and 20 minutes. And I can't wait to see what God has next.